August 2019. Jeffrey Epstein is sitting inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. He's awaiting federal trial on sex trafficking charges and facing the possibility of life in prison. The entire world is watching, and that day he signs a new will. 2 days later, he's found dead in his cell. Was there foul play? I'm Caroline Mitchell, former police detective and crime thriller author, and today I'm going to be dissecting Jeffrey Epstein's death and the red flags surrounding it, as well as the police procedure that made me do a double take. So the question isn't just, is Epstein really dead? The question is, does the official timeline hold up under scrutiny? Let's start with the first red flag. On August 8, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein executed a new will. He transferred his assets, estimated at over $500 million, into a trust. And this change to his will could complicate civil claims from victims, but let's face it, he wasn't really worried about them. But 2 days later, he was dead. Now this is where timing matters. You're in federal custody and facing serious charges with a trial and civil litigation coming. So maybe you've been advised to restructure your estate. Is that illegal? No, but it is interesting, because if this was just about the trial, then why didn't he do it months earlier, not 48 hours before his death? And the trust was registered in the US Virgin Islands, where certain financial protections can apply. Again, that doesn't prove anything, but when you're building a timeline in an unexplained death in custody, you examine behaviour in the final 72 hours very carefully. Epstein was a high-profile detainee facing trial who moved $500 million into a protected trust, and 2 days later, he was dead. That's red flag number one. And when we stack it beside what comes next, it becomes harder to ignore. And that's red flag number two. Why was he taken off watch? Before Jeffrey Epstein died, something had already happened inside that prison. On July the 23rd, 2019, he was found semi-conscious on the floor of his cell with marks around his neck. Now I have to be careful of how I phrase certain words, but I'm sure you'll know what I mean. And details of the incident are in the 2023 OIG report. It states that there was a conflicting story. Epstein told prison officials that his cellmate, who was a former police officer facing murder charges, had assaulted him. But the former officer and cellmate denied the assault, saying that he was trying to save Epstein's life after he'd attempted to end it all. An internal investigation was made, but it remained inconclusive. Either way, it was serious enough that Epstein was placed on watch, and the OIG report revealed that Epstein told a psychologist that he was a coward and he didn't like pain. And I need to explain something. Putting someone on watch is not a light decision. In custody, that is one of the highest levels of protection you can put on someone. When someone is put on watch, it means professionals believe that there is a real risk they might harm themselves, and the world was watching Epstein. He was as high profile as it got. So he should have had constant monitoring, very limited bedding, and nothing in the cell that he could hurt himself with. There would have been continual welfare checks and mental health assessments, and everything would have been documented. And I mean everything. In policing, if someone dies in custody, literally every decision made before that moment gets pulled apart. Every form, every log, every single signature. If you're an officer or a decision maker involved, your neck is on the line. So here's where people start to feel uneasy. Not long after being placed on watch, Epstein was taken off it. Medical staff cleared him as they said he didn't need it anymore. Now, could that happen? Well, yes, it absolutely could. If a mental health professional assesses a prisoner and believes that they're no longer at immediate risk, they can remove that level of supervision. But it wasn't a normal prisoner, was it? This was a man facing federal charges involving children, and someone whose names was linked to politicians, royalty, billionaires, some of the most powerful men on the planet. He was at the centre of an unprecedented global scandal, and he'd already had one serious incident in his cell. And when you combine all of that, you don't just think about his mental state, you think about risk. And if I was managing that custody block, I would have had eyes on him 24/7. When Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was arrested here in the UK, police made the decision to shut down the custody block. In custody, accountability is everything. We're trained up to think ahead, not just are they okay right now, but if something goes wrong, could we honestly say that we did everything we reasonably could? Because believe me, post-incident inquiries, they are not kind, and the people behind them, they don't take the power of hindsight into account. So that decision to take him off watch really lingers and doesn't sit easy with me. And once he was taken off watch, he went back to this special housing unit. And okay, that doesn't mean anything sinister or mean that there was some grand plan, but it does mean that one big layer of protection was removed. And to me, in a high-profile case like this, that was a dramatic failure. I mean, what changed and what was the decision to sign off on it? Because you've got to think about it. According to the Epstein files, there weren't just millionaires involved. There were possibly people in government and law enforcement too. In policing a signature, it's like a promise. It's like someone saying, I am staking my career on this fact. On the night that Epstein died, we had psychologists signing off on a 31-minute evaluation. And we had guards signing off on checks that they never actually made. But more about that later, we're jumping ahead. But when the paper trail is built on lies, the official timeline falls apart. And questions must be asked about that. Because shortly after Epstein was taken off watch, something else changed. And this is red flag number 3, and one that rings even bigger alarm bells. The cameras were turned off. Now this next part is one where most people sit back and go, wait, what? Because in any custodial setting, especially one housing high-risk prisoners, surveillance is everything. Cameras, they're not optional, they are protection. And not just for the inmate, they protect the prison and the officers too. And most of all, they protect the integrity of what happened. So after Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell on August 10, 2019, one of the first things police investigators would have looked at was CCTV. They'd be checking who went near the cell, what times the last checks were done, if anyone entered, and also who was around and was he alone. That's standard and very immediate. But funnily enough, not only was this high-profile suspect who had something on many extremely powerful people not being monitored, it seems the camera outside his cell strangely stopped working that night. Some reports said that they malfunctioned, and others said that footage was unusable. There were claims of technical issues too. I mean, yeah, cameras fail, it happens, although it's very rare. In policing, maybe sometimes body cams don't activate properly, or a shop's CCTV system might not have been recording for weeks because no one noticed the hard drive was full. So it does happen. However, in a high-security federal facility housing one of the most high-profile prisoners in the world at that time, well, you would expect multiple angles, backup systems, or even one person to notice and put that inmate on physical watch. If nothing suspicious happened, then any working CCTV would have just shut down any speculation immediately. It would have shown timestamps and movements in and out of that cell. But instead, we're left with a very unsettling absence, which leads us to the next red flag. Because the cameras weren't the only things that didn't line up, the prison checks didn't either. And this is red flag number 4, the missed checks. Now this is where my old detective brain really starts ticking. We know that earlier in July 2019, Epstein had reportedly been placed on constant watch after a prior incident in his cell, and that status was later lifted. In most custodial environments, whether you're talking about the UK or the US, someone who has shown vulnerability doesn't just go back to being an ordinary prisoner overnight. There's still enhanced checks and scheduled observations, and those checks aren't casual, like they're physically logged. An officer physically looks into the cell and they confirm that that person is alive. And I had to do it many a time in the UK where someone would be asleep and we'd have to go in and poke them to ensure that they were okay. They weren't too happy about it, but it had to be done. And then they note the time and they sign it off, and that log becomes part of the custody record. If anything happens later, that record is what investigators rely on to build a timeline. So when I read that the scheduled night checks weren't properly carried out, that's not a minor detail to me. That's the whole spine of the case. Because as an officer, death in custody is like the worst possible thing that can happen to you and your career. It's something we all guard against. And as for dishonesty in the police, that's unforgivable. 2 correctional officers were later charged with falsifying records, accused of signing off on checks that hadn't actually been done. And why were those charges eventually dismissed under a deferred prosecution agreement? Because if I was one of those officers, I'd be up and down keeping a very close eye, ensuring that everything was okay. Still, the central point remains: the checks had not been carried out. And again, that's not only serious, that's really hard to comprehend. When you sign your name to a custody log, you're confirming you physically saw that person at a specific time and they were alive. And if these answers aren't airtight, doubt creeps in. Now, we were told that the facility was understaffed and that the officers were working overtime and that the prison was under pressure. And I'll be honest, I've worked in environments where staff were stretched thin, fatigue happens, and maybe people get complacent, but never, ever when it comes to high-profile cases where the world is watching and demanding answers. This was one of the most high-profile federal prisoners in the world at that moment, and it makes these procedural failures very hard to believe. The official ruling was that he took his own life, and it relies on the premise that Epstein was alone, unobserved for a period of time, and that he acted without any interruption. But if checks weren't done properly, how can they say that, especially given that the cameras weren't recording at the same time? So we've got no constant watch, no checks, and no cameras. Time for our next red flag. And this one really lit a fire under this case, not because of what it proves, but because of how it was interpreted. After Epstein died, a prison supervisor told the FBI that staff took boxes and sheets to create a decoy body, and then they loaded it into a white van, which was labelled as the medical examiner's office, and that the media, they followed the van. But Epstein's actual body, that was loaded into a separate black van, was left unnoticed. At least that's what's in the files as part of the FBI interview memo dated August the 16th, 2019. You can look it up for yourself. So red flag number 5, the autopsy and the fractures. Whenever there's a death in custody, the post-mortem is absolutely critical. It isn't just about the cause of death, it's about mechanism, timing, injury patterns, and whether the physical evidence lines up with the official account. And this is where things became complicated. The New York City medical examiner ruled that Jeffrey Epstein's death was by his own hand, with the method of hanging. That's the official finding. Now, such deaths, they're not rare in custody, but the detail that triggered enormous debate was this. He had fractures to the hyoid bone and other structures in his neck. Now, the hyoid bone is a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the front of his neck. It's something that not everyone knows about, and to be honest, I didn't before I researched this. But in forensic pathology, it can be significant because fractures to that bone are sometimes associated with strangulation. But, and this is important, they can also occur in deaths like these, very much in older individuals. Epstein was 66 at the time of his death, and as we age, bones become more brittle, and that includes the structures in the neck. But it's rare. In the days after the autopsy, a forensic pathologist retained by Epstein's brother Mark publicly questioned the findings, suggesting that the fracture pattern was more commonly seen in homicide by strangulation. Well, that statement spread rapidly, as you can imagine. Epstein's brother is the loudest critic of the official story, and he believes that Epstein is dead. The autopsy photos have been made public and he is not disputing them. He isn't claiming it's fake death, he's claiming murder. So independent pathologists can disagree. It's not unusual in high-profile cases, as you'll often see in court. Forensic interpretation, it's not always black and white, it's about probability. And that is based on injury patterns, scene context, and medical history. The official medical examiner, well, he stood by the ruling, and in any investigation, the medical findings don't sit alone. They're considered alongside scene evidence too. When police attend any unexplained death, particularly in a controlled environment like a cell, they work kind of backwards from 3 pillars, covering scene integrity, injury consistency and opportunity. But when there are fractures that are sometimes associated with strangulation, well, that creates space for doubt. But when you add in the unusual hyoid bone injury to everything else, you can see why the public reaction was explosive, especially when an independent expert stated that the death was suspicious. So now let's circle back to the will. There's something in the Jeffrey Epstein timeline that doesn't get talked about enough, but from an investigative perspective it matters, and I'm going to explain why. On August the 8th, 2019, 2 days before he was found dead in his cell, Epstein signed a new will. It's said that he left $50 million to his lawyer, $25 million to his accountant, $10 million to Ghislaine Maxwell, $10 million to the children of a diplomat, and $50 million to Caribbean islands and properties in Manhattan, Paris, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and diamonds to his last girlfriend. People update their wills all the time, especially wealthy people facing serious criminal charges. He knew he was potentially facing life in prison, and financially and legally, well, the walls were closing in. So restructuring assets on that point, well, it's not bizarre behaviour, it's strategic. But here's why investigators would still pay attention to it. In policing, timing is everything. If someone makes a significant legal or financial move shortly before their death, that doesn't automatically mean foul play, but it absolutely becomes part of the behavioural picture. And I have dealt with many in my career, and there are patterns. Some people, they spiral into chaos. Other people become oddly methodical. They start organising paperwork, tidying up loose ends, and making arrangements. There can be a strange sense of putting their affairs in order. But this didn't seem like an emotional goodbye. It felt more like a legal manoeuvre on Epstein's part. Because Epstein's will didn't look like a man saying goodbye to the world. It looked like someone protecting his assets for the future. And psychology matters in this case. His entire identity was built on wealth, power, control, and access. And when someone facing life imprisonment dies before a trial, well, the criminal case ends. And for victims, that meant there would never be a full federal trial where evidence was laid out publicly. So when the public react with suspicion, it's not just about the ins and outs of his death, it's about what his death prevented and who else was connected to this case. And when you combine that with the camera failures, the guard lapses, the earlier incident week before, that will become one more piece of a much larger picture. And that brings me to the next issue, which is less about what happened inside the cell and more about how quickly the official conclusion was delivered to the public. So this brings us to red flag number 7. Now this next part is less about what happened inside the cell and more about what happened outside it. There's a popular theory that the media announced Epstein's death a day before it happened. Now, as someone who has dealt with digital evidence, I looked into this. Most of what you see could be time-stamped glitches or hoaxes. However, there was a leak. 38 minutes before the news broke, the details was already on a bulletin board called 4chan. Now, in my world, that's not a glitch. That's a serious breach of protocol by someone at the scene. Soon after, officials were publicly stating that Jeffrey Epstein's death appeared to be. Now, on one level that's normal. Medical examiners, they often make preliminary determinations fairly quickly, but there is a difference between saying, we are investigating this as a possible and saying, this is definitively what happened. Because when a case involves institutional failures such as camera malfunctions, missed checks, prior incidents, you really have to be careful not to look like you're closing ranks. Then something else happened that kept that doubt alive. When incompetence really benefits powerful people, it kind of stops feeling like an accident. The official conclusion still exists, but so does public suspicion, and who can blame them? Now, everything we've just discussed, the cameras, the checks, the fractures, was building towards a single moment of accountability that most people thought would never come. But in February 2026, the silence finally broke. In the UK, we have just witnessed something unprecedented in modern history. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former prince, was arrested at Sandringham, and Lord Mandelson, a titan of the British political establishment, was taken into custody just days later. As a former detective, I want you to understand the weight of the charge that they're facing, which is misconduct in public office. In the UK, this isn't just a slap on the wrist, it's a serious ancient common law offence that carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. The police are looking at the Epstein files released from January 2026, specifically the DOJ metadata that allegedly shows sensitive government information being moved through Epstein's private channels while Andrew was serving as a UK trade envoy. You've got to think about that. Andrew was held in Altrincham police station for 11 hours and he was photographed ashen-faced, leaving the back of a car. And that image will haunt the monarchy for a century. King Charles, he didn't stop this. His statement of the law must take its course means that the royal shield was officially gone, and this has never happened before. When the Met Police moved in on Peter Mandelson, well, that signalled that this wasn't just about royals, it was about government too. And the hardest thing to prove was corruption at the top, because the evidence was always lost or redacted. But 3 million pages of DOJ data is hard to redact. This isn't just news. The digital forensic trail from Epstein's life has actually outlived the silence of his death. The question now isn't if more names are coming, it's who in UK government is next to receive that knock on the door. Which brings me to the final red flag. If there's one part that stays with me more than anything else, it isn't CCTV, it isn't the guards, and it isn't even the medical findings. It's the victims. And what I hate the most is that Epstein never stood trial. Because a federal trial, it's not just about whether someone is found guilty or not guilty. It's about evidence being laid out in open court. Epstein was facing serious allegations that carried the possibility of life imprisonment, and anyone who's dipped into those awful online files knows that there were even worse things that had yet to come to light. But with Epstein out of the way, the prosecution, it loses its central figure and the energy of the case shifts. You can still pursue others, of course, and Maxwell she was prosecuted, but she's not saying much, and now the main figure of the case is gone. So what do I think? Because I was asked by my viewers to cover this case, and although this isn't like anything else I've spoken about before, well, I think it was the right time to do it. Well, I think that at the time, a lot of powerful people benefited from Epstein being out of the way, but I have to tread carefully. I'm not saying he was killed to be silenced or that he's out living his best life somewhere. I'm saying that his death silenced the possibility of a public trial. And I know about the theories saying that he's not dead at all. And I suppose when you have that much power, anything is possible. I doubt we'll ever know the full truth of what happened, but instead we have files. Millions of pages released in batches. As someone who has sat in courtrooms and watched juries absorb evidence in real time, I can tell you that there's something very grounding about seeing a case unfold properly. Even when the outcome is painful, there's a sense that the process and the victims have been honoured. Prosecuting powerful individuals requires a very high evidential threshold, and speculation is not evidence. But to me, this is far from finished, and who knows what is next to come. I only hope that the victims find the justice and the peace that they deserve. And I genuinely like to know where you sit on this, because this case has become less about one man and more about how much faith we place in the institutions meant to protect us. And once that faith starts to wobble, it's very hard to steady it again. Thanks for watching this far, and if you found value in this video, well, you know what to do. Because we're part of a community here, and I hugely appreciate your support. So until next time, don't let it give you nightmares. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you again. Bye bye for now.